On a deserted stretch of highway near Las Vegas, a lone man, Jake Foster, spots an eerie, glowing object hovering in the night sky. At first, he assumes it's a prank or some elaborate light show, but when the object moves with impossible speed and stops directly above his car, he freezes. The radio blares static, his headlights flicker, and the car stalls. As he steps out to investigate, a blinding beam of light engulfs him. What Jake discovers next will push him to the edge of sanity. Jake Foster had always found solace in solitude, and the open desert was his sanctuary. As a freelance storm chaser and photographer, he was no stranger to the surreal beauty of the Nevada wilderness. On a crisp, moonlit night, the vast expanse of the desert stretched endlessly before him. The stars seemed brighter here, far from the garish lights of the Las Vegas Strip. Jake had planned this trip to capture a meteor shower, but what he saw that night would be far beyond any earthly phenomenon. He'd been driving down an isolated stretch of highway, a road so desolate it seemed forgotten by time. The hum of his old Jeep Cherokee was the only sound as he scanned the horizon for shooting stars. A sudden flash of light to his left caught his attention. At first, he thought it might be lightning, but there were no clouds in the sky. He slowed the car, leaning over the steering wheel to get a better look. In the distance, a series of glowing orbs hovered in the air. They pulsated with an unnatural rhythm, shifting between hues of blue, green, and a color Jake couldn't even name. He grabbed his camera from the passenger seat, stepping out of the car into the cool night air. The desert was eerily quiet. Even the faint rustle of wind through the sagebrush seemed to have stopped. Through the lens of his camera, Jake zoomed in on the lights. They weren't stationary. The orbs moved with an intelligence, darting in impossible patterns. Suddenly, they aligned in a perfect triangle and began to descend. Jake's heart raced as the lights came closer, illuminating the desert floor with an unearthly glow. He'd seen enough to know this wasn't a natural occurrence, nor was it man-made. The technology required for such precise movement was far beyond anything he'd ever heard of. The orbs stopped about 50 feet above the ground, and Jake felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as the lights dimmed, revealing a massive metallic craft hovering silently. It was unlike any aircraft he'd ever seen, sleek, with no visible seams or markings. A low hum emanated from the craft, vibrating through his chest and rattling his teeth. As Jake fumbled to take another photo, the hum intensified, and his camera suddenly died. He glanced at his phone, but it too had gone black. The car's headlights flickered, and the engine stalled. Panic set in as he realized he was utterly alone, miles from civilization, with no means of communication. A beam of light shot down from the craft, enveloping him in a blinding white glow. He tried to shield his eyes, but the light was too intense. He felt weightless, as though he were being lifted off the ground. His mind screamed for him to run, but his body refused to obey. He floated upwards, his limbs frozen, his breath shallow. The light carried him into the belly of the craft, where darkness swallowed him whole. When his vision adjusted, Jake found himself in a cold, metallic room. The walls were smooth, devoid of any visible seams or doors. The air was thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe. He was restrained, his arms and legs bound by an invisible force. Panic turned to terror as figures emerged from the shadows. They were humanoid, but distinctly alien. Their heads were disproportionately large, with smooth, pale skin that seemed to glow faintly. Their eyes were black and almond-shaped, devoid of any emotion. Jake tried to scream, but no sound came out. One of the beings approached him, its elongated fingers hovering over his forehead. A searing pain shot through his skull as visions flooded his mind, images of planets, stars, and destruction. Jake's heart pounded as the pain subsided, replaced by a strange sense of calm. The beings communicated without words, their thoughts pouring into his mind. They weren't just showing him these visions. They were warning him. He was paralyzed, unable to move as they continued their examination. He felt a cold, metallic instrument press against his chest, then his arms, then his head. His skin tingled as though tiny needles were piercing him, but when he looked down, there were no visible marks. Just as suddenly as it began, the ordeal ended. The beings stepped back, their large eyes still fixed on him. The light enveloped him once more, and he felt himself being lowered back to the desert floor. When his feet touched the ground, the beam disappeared and the craft shot into the sky with incredible speed, vanishing in an instant. Jake collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. His body felt heavy and his mind was clouded with the strange images he'd been shown. He staggered back to his car, which now hummed to life as though nothing had happened. Trembling, he gripped the steering wheel, staring at the empty sky. He knew what he'd seen would haunt him forever. What he didn't know was that his nightmare had only just begun. As he drove away, Jake noticed something strange in the rearview mirror, a faint glow on his chest, right where the alien instrument had touched him. He pulled over and lifted his shirt, revealing a series of strange symbols etched into his skin, glowing faintly in the darkness. Whatever the aliens had done to him, it wasn't over. Jake Foster's heart still raced as he sped down the desert highway, his mind a chaotic storm of fear and disbelief. The glowing symbols on his chest remained faint, but they felt alive, pulsing beneath his skin. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting the UFO to return. The silence in his Jeep was deafening, broken only by the erratic hum of the engine. No matter how fast he drove, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. By the time he reached the outskirts of a small run-down gas station, the first hints of dawn began to streak the horizon. He parked haphazardly near the pumps and stumbled out of the car, his legs trembling. An elderly attendant in a grease-stained uniform emerged, eyeing Jake with concern. "You all right there, son?" the man asked, his gravelly voice cutting through the stillness. Jake hesitated. How could he explain what had happened? That he'd been abducted by beings not of this world. Instead, he nodded, muttering about needing gas and a bathroom. The attendant handed him a set of keys and gestured toward a weathered door. Inside the tiny bathroom, Jake locked the door and leaned against the sink, breathing heavily. His reflection in the cracked mirror startled him. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, and the faint glow of the symbols on his chest was unmistakable, even through his shirt. Trembling, he lifted the fabric, exposing the intricate designs. They looked like nothing he had ever seen, symbols that seemed both ancient and futuristic. He touched the markings with hesitant fingers. To his horror, they reacted. The glow intensified, and a sharp electric jolt shot through his body, forcing him to stumble backward. His vision blurred, and for a moment, the bathroom disappeared. In its place, he saw a desolate, alien landscape, barren and lifeless with dark skies and jagged mountains. He could hear whispers, faint but insistent, like voices speaking in a language he couldn't understand. The vision faded, leaving Jake gasping for air. He sank to the floor, clutching his chest. Whatever the aliens had done to him, it wasn't just physical. They had implanted something inside him, something that connected him to them. When he finally emerged, the gas station seemed eerily quiet. Jake filled his tank quickly, his eyes scanning the desert for signs of movement. He knew he couldn't stay there. He needed answers, and there was only one person who might help. Driving toward the city, Jake thought of his estranged friend, Dr. Evelyn Grant, a physicist who had worked on government projects shrouded in secrecy. Evelyn often spoke about extraterrestrial life, dismissed as a conspiracy theorist by her peers. But Jake had seen enough to know her theories might hold more truth than anyone dared believe. It was midday when Jake arrived at Evelyn's secluded home, a cabin nestled in the foothills. He hesitated before knocking, unsure of how she would react. The door creaked open, and Evelyn's sharp, analytical eyes locked onto his. Her expression shifted from annoyance to concern. "Jake?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "What happened to you?" "I need your help," he said. "It's aliens, Evelyn. I've seen them. They did something to me." Her brow furrowed and she stepped aside, motioning him in. The cabin was cluttered with books, papers, and strange equipment Jake couldn't identify. He sat on an old couch as Evelyn studied him. "Start from the beginning," she said. Jake recounted everything: the lights, the beam, the alien beings, and the symbols on his skin. When he finished, Evelyn leaned back, her eyes narrowing in thought. "I've heard of cases like this," she said finally. "Abductions, implantations, but this—" She gestured toward his chest. "This is different. The symbols, they're a language, a message, or maybe a map." "A map?" Jake echoed. Evelyn nodded. "Whatever they did to you, they didn't choose you at random. They marked you for a reason. I need to run some tests." For hours, Evelyn used her equipment to scan Jake's body, muttering as she analyzed the data. The results were unsettling. The symbols weren't just on his skin. They were embedded beneath it, radiating an energy Evelyn couldn't identify. Worse, they seemed to be evolving, their patterns shifting with each passing minute. "This isn't just a map," Evelyn said, her voice shaking. "It's a signal, and it's transmitting." Jake's stomach churned. Transmitting to what? Evelyn didn't answer. She didn't need to. Somewhere out there, the aliens were listening. And they would be coming. As night fell, Jake and Evelyn tried to formulate a plan. But deep down, Jake knew there was no escaping what had been set in motion. Whatever the aliens wanted, they weren't finished with him. And this time, they might not let him go. Evelyn's expression darkened. "Jake, we need to figure out where this map leads. And fast. It's the only chance you have of stopping whatever they've started." Jake nodded, fear settling in his chest. The faint glow of the symbols intensified, and he could feel their pull, like they were guiding him toward something. What lay ahead terrified him more than anything he had faced so far. The symbols on Jake's chest burned faintly as if responding to some invisible signal. Evelyn paced her cluttered living room, her mind racing to decipher the cryptic patterns. The hum of her equipment filled the air, a sound that somehow amplified Jake's anxiety. He sat on the edge of the couch, his head in his hands, trying to piece together what little control he had left over his life. The aliens had done something to him, something far beyond his comprehension. Evelyn abruptly stopped pacing and slammed a book down onto her desk, startling Jake. "We're not going to figure this out here," she declared, her voice firm. "If these symbols are a map, then we need to find where they lead." Jake looked up at her, his face pale. "And what happens when we get there? What if it's a trap? What if they're waiting for me?" Evelyn crossed her arms. "It might be a trap, but sitting here isn't an option. The symbols are evolving, Jake. Every hour they change. If we wait too long, we might lose whatever chance we have to understand this." Jake reluctantly nodded. Deep down, he knew she was right. He didn't have the luxury of fear anymore. "Where do we start?" Evelyn flipped through pages of an old journal, muttering to herself. Finally, she pointed to a series of coordinates scrawled in the margins. The patterns in your symbols, they match something I've seen before. Years ago, when I worked on a classified government project, we intercepted similar data. It all pointed to one location in the Nevada desert." Jake's stomach dropped. "Area 51? Evelyn shook her head. "No, farther west. It's a remote, unmarked site. Officially doesn't exist. But if I'm right, that's where the map on your chest is leading us." Without wasting another moment, they packed Evelyn's SUV with her equipment and enough supplies for a 2-day trip. The drive was silent except for the faint hum of the engine and the occasional burst of static from the radio. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed, though every time he glanced in the rearview mirror, the road behind them was empty. As they neared the coordinates, the desert began to change. The familiar landscape of scrub and sand gave way to jagged rocks and blackened earth. It felt alien, as if they had already crossed into another world. Jake's chest began to ache, the symbols glowing brighter with each mile. The closer they got, the stronger the pull became, like an invisible hand was guiding him. Finally, they reached the site, a massive, circular crater that stretched for hundreds of feet. At its center stood a metallic obelisk, its surface smooth and reflective, pulsating with a faint, otherworldly glow. Jake stepped out of the SUV, his legs trembling. He felt the symbols on his chest resonate with the obelisk, as though they were two parts of the same entity. "What the hell is this place?" Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. Evelyn was already setting up her equipment, her hands moving with practiced precision. "It's not natural, that's for sure. The energy readings here are off the charts. Whatever this is, it's not from Earth." Jake took a hesitant step toward the obelisk, his heart pounding. As he got closer, the symbols on his chest began to shift and pulse, their glow matching the rhythm of the obelisk. He felt a strange warmth spread through his body, accompanied by an overwhelming urge to touch the structure. "Wait, Jake!" Evelyn shouted, but it was too late. His hand pressed against the cool surface of the obelisk and the world around him dissolved. Jake found himself standing in a vast, empty void. The air was thick and oppressive, and the only sound was the steady hum of the obelisk, now towering above him. He turned around, searching for Evelyn, but she was gone. Instead, he was surrounded by figures, tall, slender beings with translucent skin and eyes that seemed to pierce his very soul. They didn't speak, but their presence filled his mind with images, visions of Earth engulfed in chaos, cities reduced to rubble, and humanity on the brink of extinction. Jake fell to his knees, clutching his head as the images overwhelmed him. He realized the aliens weren't just showing him the future, they were warning him. One of the beings stepped forward, extending a hand. Jake hesitated but felt compelled to take it. The moment their hands touched, a surge of energy coursed through him and the symbols on his chest flared to life. He understood now. They hadn't just marked him, they had chosen him. In an instant, Jake was back at the crater, gasping for air. Evelyn was by his side, her face pale with fear. "Jake? What happened? You were gone for 10 minutes." He looked at her, his voice trembling. "They showed me. Everything. The destruction. The chaos. It's coming, Evelyn. They're coming." Evelyn's face hardened. "Then we need to figure out how to stop it." Jake nodded, but deep down, he knew the truth. The aliens hadn't given him the power to stop them. They had given him the responsibility to prepare humanity for what was coming. And time was running out. The drive back from the crater was tense. Jake stared out of the passenger window, his mind replaying the visions the aliens had burned into his thoughts. Cities crumbled, skies darkened, and a haunting chorus of screams echoed in his memory. Evelyn drove in silence, but the tight grip on the steering wheel and the way her eyes darted to the rearview mirror every few seconds betrayed her own unease. "We can't do this alone," Evelyn said finally, her voice breaking the quiet. "If we're going to stop whatever's coming, we need help." Jake looked at her skeptically. "And who exactly do you think will help us? The military? The government? They'll lock me in some lab the moment they see what's on my chest." Evelyn frowned, biting her lip. "I know someone, a man named Conrad Bishop. He used to work on classified projects for the government before he went rogue. If anyone can help us decode the symbols, it's him." Jake sighed, leaning his head back against the seat. "I guess we don't have much choice." The journey to Conrad's remote cabin took hours. As they drove deeper into the wilderness, the symbols on Jake's chest began to tingle faintly, almost as if responding to their new surroundings. He didn't mention it to Evelyn. He wasn't sure if he was imagining things or if the alien influence inside him was growing stronger. By the time they arrived at the cabin, night had fallen, and the woods were eerily silent. The structure was small and unassuming, with no visible lights or signs of life. Evelyn knocked on the door, and after a long pause, it creaked open. A wiry man with disheveled hair and piercing blue eyes peered out. "Evelyn," he said flatly, his voice low, What are you doing here?" "I need your help," Evelyn replied. She stepped aside, revealing Jake. "It's about him." Conrad's eyes scanned Jake, lingering on his chest. His expression darkened. "You'd better come inside." The cabin was cluttered with papers, strange devices, and maps pinned to every available surface. Conrad motioned for them to sit at a battered wooden table. Without a word, he retrieved a handheld scanner and pointed it at Jake's chest. The device emitted a low hum, and its screen flickered to life. "I've seen this before," Conrad said finally, his voice grave. Or something like it. "These symbols, they're not just a map. They're a warning. Whatever's coming, it's not good." Jake leaned forward, his hands trembling. "What do you mean? What do these symbols actually do?" Conrad hesitated, his gaze flicking between Jake and Evelyn. "They're a signal, a beacon, and the longer they stay on you, the stronger that signal gets. They're calling something, or someone." Jake felt a cold wave of fear wash over him. "Calling what?" Conrad shook his head. "I don't know, but we're running out of time." Before they could continue, a faint rumble shook the cabin. Conrad froze, his face turning pale. "They found us." Jake and Evelyn exchanged panicked glances. "Who?" Evelyn asked. "The ones who've been watching me since I left the program," Conrad said grimly. "They don't want us figuring this out." The rumble grew louder, and bright headlights pierced the windows. Conrad grabbed a duffel bag from under the table and tossed it to Evelyn. "There's a tunnel in the back. Go!" "What about you?" Evelyn demanded. "I'll hold them off," Conrad said, pulling out a weapon that looked more alien than human. "Just keep moving, and whatever you do, don't stop." Jake hesitated, but Evelyn grabbed his arm, dragging him toward the back of the cabin. They found a narrow passageway hidden behind a bookshelf, just as the front door splintered open. Gunfire erupted, and Jake flinched as the sound reverberated through the walls. They stumbled through the dark tunnel, the only light coming from the faint glow of the symbols on Jake's chest. The air was damp and cold, and the walls seemed to close in around them. Jake could hear Evelyn's labored breathing ahead of him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. When they emerged from the tunnel, they found themselves in a dense forest. Evelyn paused, glancing around nervously. "We need to keep moving," she said, her voice shaky. "Conrad gave us time, but they'll come after us." Jake nodded, his chest still pulsing faintly. He could feel the symbols reacting to something, but he didn't know what. As they made their way deeper into the woods, the night seemed to grow darker, and a strange hum filled the air. "What is that?" Jake whispered, stopping in his tracks. Evelyn froze, listening. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, and then the forest was bathed in an eerie blue light. Jake's chest burned as the symbols flared to life, and he fell to his knees, gasping. "They're here," Evelyn said, her voice barely audible. Jake looked up, his vision blurred. Through the light, he could make out a massive, shadowy figure descending from the sky. The aliens had found them, and this time there would be no escape. The forest pulsed with blue light, the hum growing louder, reverberating through Jake's chest. Evelyn yanked him to his feet, desperation flashing across her face. The shadowy figure descending from the sky became clearer, a sleek, alien craft, its surface glimmering like liquid metal. Jake's chest burned intensely, the symbols flaring brightly, lighting the forest around him. "We need to move," Evelyn shouted, panic in her voice. But Jake couldn't. The pull from the craft rooted him in place. His legs felt like lead, and his head swam with visions. Chaos, fire, destruction. The aliens weren't just coming for Earth. They were coming for him. Evelyn grabbed his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Jake, fight it. Whatever this is, don't let it win. We have to get out of here." Branches snapped in the distance, and Jake turned to see figures emerging from the shadows. They weren't aliens. They were human, armed men in tactical gear, their faces hidden by helmets. Their weapons, sleek and unfamiliar, were aimed directly at Jake and Evelyn. "Down on the ground," one of them barked, his voice amplified. "Now." Evelyn's eyes darted between the soldiers and the craft, her hand twitching toward Jake's arm. "They're not here to help," she whispered, barely audible. Jake raised his hand slowly, trying to stay calm. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, the hum from the alien craft spiked, drowning out all other sound. A blinding beam of light shot down, enveloping Jake in its glow. He felt weightless, his body lifting as the world around him faded into whiteness. Evelyn's voice, calling his name, was the last thing he heard. When the light receded, Jake found himself inside the alien craft. The walls shimmered like liquid silver, and the air carried a metallic tang. He was no longer alone. Surrounding him were the tall, translucent beings from his visions, their black eyes piercing into his soul. They didn't speak, but Jake could feel their thoughts pressing into his mind. "You are the bridge," the words echoed in his head, though no lips moved. "The bridge to what?" Jake whispered. Visions flooded his mind, a dying alien world, scorched and barren, desperate inhabitants reaching out to the stars. Earth, vibrant with life, was their salvation. The symbols on his chest weren't just a signal. They were a key. "They need me to open something," Jake realized, fear washing over him. The beings stepped closer, their elongated fingers hovering above the glowing symbols. A sharp pain surged through him as the patterns began to shift, rearranging like a living puzzle. Jake screamed, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. The pain stopped abruptly. The beings stepped back as the walls rippled like water. A massive, circular doorway appeared before Jake, its edges lined with glowing symbols that matched his skin. "This is why you were chosen," the alien voices said in unison. Jake stared at the doorway. "What's on the other side?" The beings were silent. The doorway began to hum, its glow intensifying, pulling Jake forward. He tried to resist, but the pull was irresistible. As he crossed the threshold, the world dissolved. Jake was back in the forest, but everything had changed. The trees were scorched, their leaves blackened. Alien growths littered the ground, pulsing with faint light. Evelyn was nowhere to be seen, but the soldiers were still there, fighting something else. Massive, insect-like creatures burst from the alien growths, their bodies armored in black. Gunfire echoed through the forest, but the creatures moved too quickly, their limbs slicing through anything in their path. The soldiers' weapons were useless. Jake ducked behind a fallen tree, his chest glowing again. He felt connected to the creatures, their energy reacting to him. One of them turned its many-eyed head toward Jake, screeching before charging, its razor-sharp limbs cutting through the air. Jake braced himself. The symbols on his chest flared brighter than ever, and the creature stopped abruptly as if hitting an invisible wall. It screeched again, this time almost fearful. Instinctively, Jake raised his hand. A surge of energy burst from his palm, striking the creature. It disintegrated instantly, collapsing into ash. What did I just do?" Jake muttered, staring at his hand in disbelief. "Jake!" Evelyn's voice called out. He turned to see her crouched behind a tree, motioning for him. Dodging the chaos, Jake ran to her. "What's happening?" he demanded. Evelyn's face was pale but determined. "I don't know, but whatever those symbols are, they're not just a key. They're a weapon." Jake shook his head. "A weapon for what?" Evelyn's voice softened, but her eyes were sharp. "For a war, Jake, and I think you're the only one who can fight it." The sounds of screeching and gunfire filled the air, but Jake barely heard them. As the alien creatures swarmed the forest, he realized she was right. The aliens hadn't just chosen him. They'd made him into something more. He wasn't just a bridge. He was humanity's last chance to survive. The forest burned around them, the air thick with smoke and the screams of dying soldiers. Alien creatures swarmed, their sharp, insect-like limbs tearing through anything in their path. Evelyn crouched behind a fallen tree, her breath ragged. Jake sat beside her, his chest still glowing faintly, the symbols on his skin pulsing in rhythm with the chaos. "Jake," Evelyn whispered, gripping his arm tightly, "we can't stay here. Those things won't stop until they kill everything." Jake nodded, his mind racing. He could still feel the strange energy coursing through him, the same force that had obliterated the creature earlier. The symbols weren't just marks. They were alive, connected to something much larger. "Where do we go?" Jake asked. Evelyn scanned the burning forest. "There's a clearing up ahead. If we can get there, we might figure out what to do next." Jake hesitated. "And then what? I can't keep running. Whatever they did to me, it's not going away." Evelyn met his gaze, her expression hardening. "Then, we stop running. We fight." Before Jake could respond, a screech pierced the air. One of the creatures lunged over the tree, its serrated limbs slashing downward. Jake grabbed Evelyn, pulling her out of the way as the creature's claws tore into the wood, sending splinters flying. His chest flared with light, and the creature froze, its many eyes locking onto him. Jake raised his hand instinctively. Energy surged through him, and a beam of light shot from his palm, striking the creature midair. It screeched, its body disintegrating into ash before it hit the ground. Jake stumbled, gasping for air. Evelyn stared at him, her eyes wide. "Jake, how are you doing that?" "I don't know," Jake said, his voice trembling. "It just happens." Evelyn grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet. "We don't have time to figure it out. Let's go." They sprinted through the forest, dodging debris and alien creatures. The soldiers' screams faded as more bodies fell. When they finally reached the clearing, Jake stopped abruptly, his chest burning brighter than ever. In the center of the clearing stood an obelisk, larger than the one he had seen before. Its surface shimmered, and the symbols on Jake's chest pulsed in rhythm with the light emanating from it. "What is that?" Evelyn asked, her voice trembling. Jake shook his head. "I think it's calling me." Evelyn stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "No, we don't know what it is. It could kill you." Jake's expression hardened. "If this is what they want, maybe it's the only way to stop them." Evelyn hesitated, then stepped aside, her eyes filled with fear. "Just be careful." Jake approached the obelisk, his heart pounding. As his hand touched its surface, a surge of energy shot through him, and the world around him dissolved into darkness. He opened his eyes to find himself in a vast void, the translucent beings surrounding him once more. Their black eyes bore into his soul, and their thoughts pressed into his mind. "You are the bridge," they said in unison. Jake clenched his fists. "What does that mean? Why me?" Visions flooded his mind. Earth consumed by chaos, the alien creatures swarming across cities, humanity on the brink of extinction. Then he saw a massive gateway, glowing with the same symbols that marked his chest. "The gateway is the key," the being said. "Through it, the war will end." Jake's chest burned as the symbols shifted, their patterns rearranging. He felt the weight of their purpose pressing into him. The gateway wasn't just a key, it was a weapon, capable of destroying the creatures and their masters, but using it would come at a cost. "What happens to me?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. The beings were silent. Jake didn't need them to answer. He knew. He thought of Evelyn, of the soldiers, of the billions of lives depending on him. Jake closed his eyes, his resolve hardening. "I'll do it," he said. The void dissolved, and Jake was back in the clearing. The obelisk's light flared, crackling with energy. Evelyn ran toward him, her face pale. "Jake, stop!" she screamed. "You don't have to do this." Jake turned to her, his expression calm. "It's the only way. Tell them, Evelyn. Tell them to be ready. This isn't over." Before she could respond, the obelisk erupted with light, enveloping Jake in its glow. He felt the energy consume him, the symbols on his chest burning hotter than ever. The last thing he heard was Evelyn's voice, calling his name. Then there was nothing. In the aftermath, the alien creatures vanished, their bodies turning to ash. The soldiers who survived reported seeing a blinding light, followed by silence. When they returned to the clearing, the obelisk was gone. Evelyn stood alone, clutching Jake's notebook, its pages filled with sketches of the symbols. She stared at the empty space where he had stood, her heart heavy. "This isn't over," she whispered. Far above Earth in the cold expanse of space, another gateway began to glow.